Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, where we'll be focusing on the work that RoSPA and Dräger have been doing together on managing the misuse of drink and drugs while at work and driving for work. I'm Becky Guy, I'm a Senior Policy Manager here at RoSPA, and I'll be chairing today's session. I'm delighted today to be joined by Gillian White and Mark Burrup. So just to give you a quick introduction, Mark Burrup is the EMEA Marketing Manager for Impairment at Dräger. Since graduating with a degree in Chemical and Process Engineering, Mark has gained over 30 years of experience at Dräger, and he's been focusing on impairment screening and gas detection. And during this time, Mark has assisted many countries with their approval processes for police screening and evidential breathalyzers. He was instrumental in the launch of Dräger's drug testing solution in 2015, and he was responsible for the first Home Office approved saliva-based drug test in the UK. Mark is really active in promoting the adoption of interlock breath alcohol ignition systems, and since the general safety regulations were introduced, he's worked with several vehicle manufacturers on the integration of Dräger's devices into their vehicles. And to introduce Gillian, so Gillian White is the UK Marketing Manager for Impairment at Dräger, and she's responsible for the company's UK drug and alcohol testing portfolio. Having worked in the health and safety industry for 15 years, Gillian joined Dräger 2 years ago. A fully qualified marketing professional, Gillian works to raise awareness of risks posed to workers and to offer practical guidance on how to improve safety by campaigning. And she has co-authored white papers that have contributed to some of the debates on health and safety regulation, product quality, PPE procurement, and pandemic preparedness. So if you have any questions during today's session, please could you pop them in the chat box and we'll come to them at the end of the presentation. So I'm now going to hand over to Gillian to do her presentation. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome everybody, and thank you to Becky for that introduction. So thanks everyone for joining us today. As Becky said, my name's Gillian White and I'm the UK Impairment Manager at Dräger, Impairment Marketing Manager. I'll be talking you through the main body of the presentation this morning, and later Mark is more than happy to answer any questions that you have. So please, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat as we go along, and Mark will pick them up at the end. So if we could go to the first slide, please. So our presentation today is broadly split into 3 main areas. Firstly, we'll look at the risks and the costs of impairment to UK businesses, and also some of the wider costs associated to the economy and to society. Also, it's as the second point, we'll look at managing and preventing drug and alcohol use in the workplace. Here we'll look at areas that it's worth considering if you're going to introduce a policy, or that you should be aware of if you have a policy in place already. It's worth bearing in mind that we're not going to tell you how to write the policy, just what you need to take into consideration. And then I'll talk you through the different screening and testing methods that are available. There are a number of different methods available out there, and some are going to be more appropriate to you than others. So if you're trying to screen for current impairment in the workplace, hopefully we'll be able to point you in the right direction. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll have a good understanding of drugs and alcohol, the risks they pose, and how to manage that risk. So we'll move on first to the cost of work impairment in UK workplaces. So looking at the costs, I will say it's quite difficult to find statistics on this subject. It's an area that most organisations don't want to publicise. So we have had a look at a few figures. So if we could go to the next slide, please, and the next one. Thank you. So first off, looking at the cost of alcohol to UK workplaces, the Institute of Alcohol Studies conducted a survey into what they refer to as the previously neglected phenomena of alcohol-related presenteeism, and that is the cost of when people are less productive than usual at work as a result of drinking, either because they're working whilst intoxicated or they're hungover. So they asked British workers how their work had been affected both by their own drinking and by the drinking of others. And they found that 42% of respondents had gone to work hungover. And on average, those workers rated their performance as being 39% less effective than usual. So this implied that people working whilst hungover or under the influence of alcohol costs UK businesses approximately 1.2 to 1.4 billion per year. And I've put the lower estimate up here. The IAS also went on to create an impact assessment paper, and this calculated the cost of lost productivity due to alcohol for the UK economy. And they've estimated this figure to be about 7.3 billion. So in addition to presenteeism, here they also added in absenteeism, also the cost of premature death of working age people, and also unemployment. So a considerable figure again. Now, looking at drugs, the figures are much, much more difficult to find and quite often run into many billions. The one I've referenced here is from the UK Addiction Treatment Centres, and they estimate that substance abuse costs UK businesses, I'll say, around 1.4 billion. Now, since I wrote this presentation, that figure has changed to 15 billion, but I'm not sure what that figure is constructed of. So I'd be inclined to treat this figure with a little bit of caution. But the key message here is that the costs are significant and they've not been studied or estimated. But you know, it's very significant and we need to address this issue. Looking more widely at the social and economic costs to the whole of England, the UK and society, Public Health England stated a cost of 10.7 billion costs for illicit drug misuse and 21.5 billion cost of alcohol related harm to society. Now, this takes in things like deaths because of substance misuse, also costs to the NHS, crime figures, and in the case of alcohol, they include lost productivity as well. Now, interestingly, the reason why the government estimated these figures was to support their arguments for their investment in managing, treating, and preventing drug and alcohol use in society. And they found that for every £1 that they spent on alcohol treatment, £3 was saved. And for every £1 that they spent on drug treatment, that figure rose to £4 being saved. So for us, it does show that investing in the management and prevention of impairment is certainly money well spent. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So with a safety background, I'm always uncomfortable just talking about the costs of impairment. So let's some of the risks that impairment can lead to in UK workplaces that actually affect the safety of workers. So workplace risks that are associated with drug and alcohol come from the effect that the substances have on an individual's body and their resulting behaviours. Now, people take substances to become impaired really do pose a risk to safety, in particular if they're driving for work. And here we're not just talking about, you know, a salesperson driving to a customer or someone who drives a HGV. It can range from someone driving a forklift truck in a yard or a warehouse, or driving a crane or a digger on a construction site, or someone responsible for driving public transport. Currently, one of the biggest areas of road accidents is delivery drivers, and these are those small vans that are being used by companies to transport to household deliveries. So beyond driving, the HSE also recommends that we look at safety critical roles, and they define those roles such as those where any drug or alcohol misuse can have a very serious outcome. So they include driving, but also add in using machinery, using electrical equipment, or ladders, or working at height, operating heavy lifting equipment. And you could also look at other roles, so include anyone who's working with hazardous substances, say. So what do drugs do? Sedatives lead to slower reaction times. They can cause drowsiness and fatigue. And someone on stimulants could have lots of energy, be really active and feel invincible in general. And both can lead to the behaviours in the workplace that pose risk to other individuals. So they can reduce the hazard awareness. They can cause people to miss the safety warnings. Stimulants can cause people to be overconfident and take risks and lead to unsafe decision making. Some people can also become quite aggressive, and this can cause conflict. So these can lead to increased accidents, increased injuries, and increased fatalities. And the thing to remember, it's not only the person that is taking the substance that is at risk here. It's also affecting other workers, their colleagues, and also possibly the general public and the wider families of those people involved. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So while safety is very much the focus of this presentation, it's also worth highlighting the other risks that a business may face. There are commercial risks that can pose significant costs to a business, and we've highlighted some of them on this slide. So you've got your operational costs. They're the loss of productivity. This is where your production line's not working anymore. There's reduced quality of work. That can happen because of mistakes or something going wrong in production. You've got lost time due to intervention. Health and safety managers always tell me about the length of time it takes for any accident interventions and reporting, or investigations and reporting, I should say, or any HSE involvement. And also you've got the cost of staff turnover. If you're constantly having to recruit and train new staff, this can take considerable cost and time as well to get people up and running as effectively as they can possibly be in their role. There are also legal costs. You can have compensation. There can be damage to other people's property. A lorry could hit a gatepost or something like that. And you've also got liability for accidents. So any harm that is caused to other individuals by an employee of your organisation. Fines for regulatory environments. We're all aware of HSE fines, but there's a lot of legal requirements and compliance that's required in this area, and you could have potential lawsuits too. Reputational costs, probably something everybody is aware of. If you have an accident at work due to impairment, it will lead to negative publicity, and this could lead to loss of customer confidence, loss of contracts, and make you less competitive in the long run. And then security costs is something that people don't always really see. So impairment can lead to theft from the organisation if somebody needs to support a dependency. It can also lead to security breaches, and particularly breaches of data, I would say, and also misuse of company property. You do hear quite ingenious stories, I would say, of people misusing vans, company vans, or I've even heard of wheelie bins being used inappropriately to transport drugs. And there's also fraud and also threat of manipulation. So if you have employees who are dependent on substances, other employees may take advantage of that and try to manipulate them in some way. Similarly, a corporation could be manipulated as well. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll take a look at some of the legal things that you could consider when you're looking at developing a policy. So, legal costs. So employers who knowingly allow employees to work under the influence of drugs and so place their co-workers, I'd say, or the public at risk of harm could be found liable. So you need to look at be aware of the Health and Safety at Work Act. So this means that employers have a duty to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that the health and safety and welfare of their employees is cared for. So this includes creating a safe work environment, so obviously one without impairment, and employers will need to demonstrate that they've minimised the risk of impaired behaviour and any impaired behaviour that may compromise safety or cause harm to workers or to the public. And we've also got the management of health and safety at work regulations. So here employers have a duty to assess risks to the health and safety of their employees. And these include substance misuse. And you also may have to prove that you've implemented measures to control them. So if you knowingly allow an employee to carry on working whilst under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and this puts others at risk, then you could be prosecuted. You've also got the Misuse of Drugs Act. Now, this is slightly different because this covers the knowing use of work premises for the supply of drugs or for the use of production of drugs. And then we come on to the Health and Safety Offences Act. Now, substance abuse isn't directly the subject of this act. However, drug and alcohol misuse becomes a health and safety offence when it causes or contributes to an unsafe behaviour at work. There's other transport-specific laws in sectors like road, rail, marine and aviation, and being impaired by drugs or alcohol while operating a vehicle is a specific offence in those sectors. So employers in these industries really must enforce strict testing and impairment policies. So next slide, please. So started to look at environmental risks as well that are caused by impairment. And the one that always springs to mind for me is the Exxon Valdez oil tanker crash in 1989. Now, interestingly, when I started to research this, impairment wasn't the cause of this crash, but it shows that for quite a number of years, I've thought it was. And at the time, it was widely reported as causing the crash of this oil tanker. And it went on to spill 11 million gallons of crude oil and contaminated 1,300 miles of shoreline. Now, when you look into this, the captain of the ship had been drinking prior to the crash. And you start to look at the investigations. You can see his blood alcohol content. You can see the damage to the reputation for the organisation. And in general, it was the perception then, and to some extent now, is that that crash was caused by impairment. And that wasn't the case. But this still shows the risk of having somebody drinking whilst in charge of a tanker. And also the reputational damage that was done later on, not to mention the environmental damage. Similarly, in 2007, the container ship, the Costco Busan, struck a support tower of a bridge in San Francisco and went on to release 53 gallons of fuel, fouling about 26 miles of the shoreline. Now, for this, the probable cause was deemed to be the pilot's degraded cognitive performance. That was due to his use of impairing prescription medication. So it does go to show that it can be alcohol, it can be drugs, it can be prescription drugs that damages a person's performance. And in terms of environmental considerations, it's worth considering, are there risks of spills? Is it oil? Is it chemical? Is it anything else? We know, I often use the example of orange juice. We often think that harmful substances that we perceive to be harmless won't harm the environment, but orange juice is so toxic. I know Mark always uses the example of milk because milk can deoxygenate water if it gets into the watercourse. So again, milk can be incredibly harmful to the environment. Other environmental issues could be fire that are caused by accidents due to impairment or any other consideration. It is difficult to find examples. They obviously aren't widely reported. So, as I say, consider any potential environmental risks that may happen from your activities. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So we can have a look now in how to manage and prevent drug and alcohol misuse in the workplace. And to provide a structure of this, we'll use the framework that's broadly recommended for an organisation's drug and alcohol policy. And it's worth mentioning that I'm going to highlight the main considerations that you need to look at when developing a policy. Obviously, you'll need to develop a policy that is specific to your business and that would meet your requirements. So first off, we'll look again at the legal considerations. So these are the legal considerations that you need to think of when you're developing your policy. So we could have a look at the next slide, please. So firstly, your drug and alcohol policy must align with both UK employment law and also health and safety regulations. We've said before that as an employer, you've got a duty to protect your workforce and from all foreseeable risks, and those include those linked to drug and alcohol misuse. So the key laws that you need to consider are employment law. So the Employment Rights Act says that any disciplinary action, including a dismissal for substance misuse, must follow a fair procedure. So make sure that you have the correct processes in place, that they're followed, and that they're well documented as well. Then there's the data protection laws, such as the Data Protection Act and the UK General Data Protection Regulation, which we know as GDPR. So anything like medical information, drug test results, or alcohol screening data is sensitive personal data. So employers are legally required to obtain informed written consent for testing in the first place. And once they have that data, they must handle that data lawfully, transparently, and securely. Now, I'm not going into that in a lot of detail in this presentation, but there is more information on it in the RoSPA guide that we've created. And you can also find a lot more information online about this. There's also human rights considerations. So under the Human Rights Act, employees have the right to privacy. Anything that's considered intrusive testing could potentially be a breach if this isn't justified. And importantly, you need to consider equality and disability considerations as well. So you've got the Equality Act. This prohibits discrimination and any compliance with equality legislation means that you have to ensure that no group is unfairly targeted or disadvantaged. And this includes avoiding bias in selecting individuals for testing or unfairly treating employees who are on prescription medication, say. Now, dependency isn't a protected characteristic, but conditions relating to it can be. So employers must avoid any discrimination against employees who have an alcohol or drug dependency, and particularly if they're undergoing treatment or rehabilitation. You may have to put reasonable adjustments in place for employees who are recovering from substance misuse. So the next slide, please. So the next step when you're starting to look at building a policy is to draft a policy statement. And it's a really, really helpful first step. So a clear policy statement states the purpose of your drug and alcohol policy and helps to set the tone when you're implementing that policy. You can be really explicit, saying why you're introducing the policy, talking about the legal obligations that you meet, and the company's position on drug and alcohol use at work. So the next slide, please. And then once you have done that, start to think about the scope of your policy. And a good framework for this is who, what, where, and how. You know, who's going to be covered by it? Is it your employees? Is it your contractors? What about agency or temporary staff? You need to make that very clear. And then everyone will know that they are what their own responsibilities are. Also talk about substances covered. Is it alcohol, drugs? What about prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs or medicines? And what about legal highs and controlled drugs? These are becoming more popular and more common at the moment. Also talk about what circumstances are covered, what situations are covered by the policy. Yep, it may cover people who are working on site and during work hours, but what happens if they go off site? What happens if they're impaired when they're representing the company elsewhere? And what about work-related events? We're coming up to Christmas. Is it acceptable for people to drink and take drugs at Christmas parties? What about, you know, functions, networking events, that kind of thing? And also finally, your policy, think about how it covers the behaviour of the individuals. So really, obviously, use, possession or distribution of drugs or alcohol on the company premises isn't going to be accepted. But thinking of alcohol, can people drink on on company premises? Is that acceptable? What do you do about people who are coming into work impaired? Again, it's that, what do you do about people using or drinking or drugs, using drugs or drinking during work hours as well? So cover all of these. You decide exactly what your policy needs to cover, also what it doesn't need to cover to maintain a safe workplace for you. Okay, and the next slide, please. So it's worth looking at determining the circumstances for testing. So if you look at pre-employment screening, screening before employment, helps to establish a baseline fitness for work, particularly in safety critical roles. So the tests can include checks for alcohol or drugs or both, and ensure that a prospective and new employee knows what's expected of them and they understand and meet your organisational policy. Random testing is really popular and particularly effective in acting as a deterrent, and it encourages a culture of responsibility and safety. So as employees are selected for testing at random and without prior notice, this reinforces the expectation that everyone is sober while performing at work. However, if you do choose to implement random testing, I would say that you must be able to provide evidence on how your random selection's managed and prove that it's random as well. There's also post-incident testing, and this will help you to determine whether drugs or alcohol contributed to an incident, whether an accident or an error, and it'll help you to support root cause analysis and with your reporting, and hopefully it'll help to prevent future events too. Then you've got for cause testing, sometimes called suspicion-based testing, and this occurs when there's a reasonable belief that an employee is under the influence of alcohol or drugs. This takes really careful documentation. You need a clear policy to support you, and also training for managers so that they can identify impairment fairly and consistently as well. Then you've got ongoing monitoring and review. This could be required when you're working with a person who has a known dependency, and you need to ensure that they're not misusing drugs. It can be used to prove a period of abstinence, say, and usually this is more used over a period of time. Then you have condition of access, and this is particularly useful where using contractors who may not be contractors' employees, or anybody who's entering your site who isn't an employee. So if you see the image, Dräger worked really closely with a lot of organisations who breathalyse drivers who are coming onto a site. So, or anyone who's going through a turnstile, say, to access a site. And this ensures that no workers aren't entering the site while they're under the influence of alcohol. And there are specific breathalyzers that are really useful for this, and you can do rapid testing so that you can get a lot of people onto site quickly and make sure that they're not impaired. Okay, and the next slide. So the next slide is about before you implement a policy, decide on what you're going to do to enforce that policy. And this is about support for your employees and any disciplinary actions that you may need to take. And these need to be appropriate, I would say. So supportive interventions can offer support to infected employees, and you can see the list there. And these can lead to better long-term outcomes, and your staff feel supported, and this will help them to demonstrate a commitment to the organisation. This approach has a lot of benefits. It retains your skills and experienced workers, and it can preserve knowledge of an individual organisation. It can take a lot of time to get someone up to speed to learn the ways of a new organisation. It can reduce the staff turnover costs that we mentioned before, and also employees feel supported and are more likely to remain engaged and productive. Sometimes though you do need the disciplinary measures, and this is where a clear and consistent disciplinary policy will really help you to manage your drug and alcohol misuse. The policy enables upfront communication outlining the consequences of misuse. So it'll help employees understand the seriousness of the issue and also the potential repercussions. And depending on the severity, employers may apply informal action. This could be a conversation, or if there's early signs noted, perhaps offering a little bit of help. There can be formal warnings in the case of misconduct, but not quite gross misconduct, where an employee is in breach of policy, but it's not an immediate dismissal level. And then the suspension, sometimes with pay, sometimes without pay. And this is quite common practice, especially if safety is at stake. And this can be suspension pending the results of an investigation. And then there's summary dismissal or dismissal for gross misconduct. And this tends to happen in cases where an individual is under the influence while they're working in a safety critical position, or driving, or supplying illegal drugs at work, etc. Okay, so the next slide. So we're going to go on to this in quite a lot more detail in a minute. So this will talk about how you need to select the screening and test method that is appropriate for you in your organisation. There's lots of different methods available, as we've said. And firstly, I'd recommend that you look at what you'll be using the screening for. Think back to your scope, think back to your circumstances for testing that we've just covered. And also consider things like speed at which your results are required. Do you need to prove someone's impaired straight away? Do you need results that have a legal defensibility? And how many tests do you need? What are the tests? What's the cost of those tests going to be? And as I say, we'll talk about this a lot more in the next section. But as you're going through considering the development of your policy, this is important to think about. And then really, really importantly, on the next slide, think about how you're going to train your staff and how you're going to communicate your policy to the staff. So this is a really, really important point and can make a huge difference in the acceptance of your policy. So you need to communicate to all employees, and this is about raising awareness of your policy and engaging with the workers. So tell them about the launch of the policy, make it easily available. Often if you have like lots of people in different areas of a site, downloadable on an intranet isn't enough. You may have to have it written and accessible for everybody. You may have to have it translated into different languages. Describe the training that you're going to give people so that they fully understand the policy, and talk about the access to support. So if people are concerned, if they do have issues, they know where to go for help. And then just ensure everyone understands their responsibilities and what it means to them. Then take on training for all employees. And this makes sure everyone understands what the policy is all about. And it's the who, what, where, and how that we went through in the previous slide. Once everyone knows all those details, it should be pretty clear. Now, before you do that, you definitely need to train your managers or your supervisors, particularly those who are going to be responsible for enforcing your policy. So train them how to recognise the signs of misuse in the first place. And then if they see misuse, what do they do? How do they handle that misuse? What if there's a suspected misuse? What do they actually do? Do they take them to a different location? Do they stop them from working? How do they actually request a test for that employee? Or do they undertake the test for themselves? So you'd have to train them how to do the testing. And then train them on what they do once they get those results back. How do they handle that with the worker? And tell them also, train them on how to discipline or how to support the employees afterwards. So having the policy and then training your staff and communicating the staff this is a really, really important step for you, and one that a lot of companies kind of miss or get a little bit wrong. So I can't overemphasize the importance of this bit enough. And so to summarize on the next slide, I have done a quick checklist of everything that I've gone through in the development of a policy. So this should help you check that you've covered everything. I would say that if for health and safety managers, it's really important to work with your HR department on this. And there is a lot of support available from organisations like the CIPD, and these are all referenced in the RoSPA guide. In addition, we work with specialist impairment partners at Dräger, and they can support you with policy development and also on-site testing for drug and alcohol. And there's also organisation, and we work with a lot of organisations in this way. If you'd like us to put you in contact with an appropriate partner, please just get in touch and we can do so. Or if you'd like any more information on how to implement a policy, just get in touch with us directly. Thank you. So next slide. So here we'll start to go through the into a deeper dive into testing and screening. So I'm going to go through alcohol first, and then drugs as a slightly different, and I'll go through how each works on the body. And I think this helps to explain the differences in testing methods, and hopefully by the end you'll understand the differences in the different methods and be able to choose the ones that are most appropriate for you. So to have a look at the next slide. So some useful facts on alcohol. What is alcohol and what are we testing for? Without going into the chemistry too much, drinking alcohol is an organic compound. It's ethanol. Other alcohols include methanol and also isopropanol, and these are used in industry. But the one that we're focusing on here is ethanol. Now, looking at the volume versus the ethanol content in different drinks, the amount of alcohol content is the same in relation to different standard volumes for drinks. So what do I mean by this? In the UK, I'd say that 1 unit of alcohol is defined as 8 grams or 10 millilitres of pure ethanol. So generally speaking, this is the amount of alcohol that an adult can process in an hour. And so having a unit defined in this way helps us to compare the alcohol in a pint of lager with a glass of wine with a shot of spirits. It should always, 1 unit of alcohol is always that same measurement, same quantity of ethanol. And how do we measure it? So if you see here, this is a screen grab I've taken from the government's website. Levels of alcohol in the UK are measured in micrograms per 100 millilitres of breath, milligrams per 100 millilitres of blood, or milligrams per 100 millilitres of urine. And we'll go on to the levels in a little while we talk about driving. So if we can move on to the next slide, I'll talk you really quickly through how the human body is influenced by alcohol. So when you drink some alcohol, the liquid runs down the mouth, into the gullet, into the stomach, and into the small intestines. And this is your absorption phase. Small amount is absorbed during that process, but the majority of alcohol will go into the stomach, where a portion of it's absorbed, and the rest of the alcohol then goes into the small intestine. If consumed on an empty stomach, a larger proportion of the alcohol goes into the body's bloodstream immediately. If it's drunk on a full stomach, it takes longer as the alcohol mixes with the contents of the stomach. The remainder of the alcohol goes into the small intestine, and here it diffuses through the wall, passing into your capillaries into the bloodstream. So in stage 2, the alcohol is distributed through your whole body system. It's taking to your tissues and organs, including the brain, where it causes impairment, and to the liver, where it starts to be broken down, and also to the lungs. And this is where a gas exchange occurs. And so this is why we can measure alcohol in the human breath. Now, in the elimination stage, alcohol is broken down or metabolized in the liver, and the degradation products are transported out of the body. So here, this is why you can use urine to test for ethanol, and also mostly for alcohol metabolites, ETG and ETS. Okay, so the next slide. Now, for this presentation, we are mostly going to focus on breath alcohol testing because it is the most commonly used in industry. However, there are other screening methods available, and I will quickly talk through them. Now, blood testing is the most accurate blood alcohol content indicator. It detects very recent alcohol use and is really, really widely accepted methodology. And it's not more widely used in industry because the testing is invasive and because it's expensive. It is used where there's been a positive breath test or in post-investigative investigations. So it is one of the gold standards of testing for alcohol impairment. But as I say, the testing is slightly impractical in the workplace. Urine testing tests your alcohol metabolites. It can detect recent alcohol use, but it is slightly delayed as it takes time for the alcohol to work through the body. So it's useful in looking at misuse and not necessarily current intoxication. And you can get into arguments over lifestyle, over workplace testing, if metabolites are still, in the urine, but the person may not necessarily be impaired at that moment in time. Oral fluid, I'll only touch on very quickly because it's not really commonly used to screen for alcohol. You can detect ethanol in oral fluid and it can show recent alcohol use, but it doesn't give an exact blood alcohol concentration measurement, and it isn't widely used. Now, hair testing you will have heard of. So a strand of hair is taken and sent to the lab. This won't show recent use, and it certainly won't show current impairment, but it can be used to show or illustrate long-term patterns of alcohol use. This is more widely used, I'd say, for pre-employment screening or to monitor ongoing substance misuse. But really, we are looking at, I'd say, breath alcohol testing in more detail today, as it is more widely used in industry. So if we could have a look at the next slide, please. So breath alcohol testing is used really widely in industry because there's a direct correlation between the breath alcohol content and the concentration of alcohol in the blood, and this has been proven. So you can get an accurate blood alcohol content measurement from a breath sample. So it is by far the most common method of screening for alcohol. At Dräger, we sell breathalyzers globally. We sell them into industry in the UK, and we also supply the UK police force. So it is an acceptable method of roadside testing for the police. It shows recent consumption and current impairment. You get an instant blood alcohol reading, and you also get an accurate measurement. It's non-invasive, it's really quick and easy. An individual simply has to blow into the mouthpiece. You don't need any specialist facilities beyond at all. So that's it. The breath screening is relatively straightforward. As you've probably gathered, it's the policy and how you introduce this that is probably a little bit more complicated. So I'll talk a little bit about alcohol and driving. So if you could move to the next slide, please. This is quite an old slide on accident probabilities while driving, and this demonstrates that the risk of an accident really does increase with the amount of alcohol in a person's blood, and even small amounts of alcohol that have been taken increase accident risk considerably. Now, I'm not going to go into this more detail, but it does show that even if, you know, at low blood alcohol contents of 0.5, say, that risk is increased considerably, and at 1.5, you're 25 times more likely to have an accident than one with a BOC. So it's worth considering what your alcohol limit is going to be when you're implementing for drivers when you're implementing your policy. And if we have a look at the next slide, you can see what the drink drive limits are for the UK. Now, in England, we have 35 micrograms per 100 millilitres of breath. It's different in Scotland. It's only 22. Now, our drink driving limits are much higher than many other European countries, and the plan at the moment, there's a consultation out there to reduce the breath alcohol limit from 35 to 22 in England, so that it's the same, and we're at the same limit as Scotland. For anybody exceeding these limits is a criminal offence, and I'm sure you're aware the penalties are severe for the individual. They can have a driving ban or a fine, and there can be serious consequences for the organisation too. So as I say, when you're considering your policy, it's really critical what you consider to be an appropriate limit to impose for the drivers of your organisation. Okay. And one other element I should mention, if we can have a look at the next slide, is the use of interlock systems to prevent drink driving. So interlock systems are something that we use globally, particularly working in the Nordics and France with school bus manufacturers, and Australia on driver impairment programs. And these are systems that are installed into a vehicle, sort of into the glove compartment or the dashboard, and they require a driver to take a breath test before they're able to start the car. So if a driver provides a negative breath alcohol test, they're unable to start the ignition of the car. If they're able to start the ignition of the car, and if the device detects alcohol above a certain preset limit, it'll prevent them from starting the vehicle. So something that we're increasingly working with vehicle manufacturers on, and beginning to see the introduction of this in the UK. So I'll move on to drug screening next. Okay. So very quickly, what are drugs? Drugs are they can be natural, they can be semi-synthetic or fully synthetic. They alter the body's function physically or psychologically. They're taken for the purpose of bringing around a change in consciousness and experience, and they'll vary greatly depending on the individual person, size, weight, gender, etc. The drug itself, there are many, many drugs out there. How it's taken, we'll talk about that in a minute, and the environment it's taken in. And if we looked at the next slide, again, there's 4 different stages that drugs, sorry, the next slide again. Catch up, yeah. There's 4 different stages that that a path of drugs goes through in the human body. And I'll talk about those in a little bit of detail in a minute. But it's worth looking at the diagram on the right-hand side, because this shows you how the concentration of the drug decreases as it works through the body, and the concentration of the metabolites increases as the drug works through the body. And this will help you to test, and this will be significant when you look at the windows of detection and impairment later on. So if we look at the path through the body more closely, and the next slide, please. Drugs can be administered in a number of different ways. They can be inhaled, injected, snorted, or ingested. And this does affect how quickly they affect the body and the brain. So injection goes into the bloodstream and takes effect very quickly, almost immediately, whereas ingestion needs a drug to go through the digestive system and can delay the effect. Now, from there, the drug is absorbed into the bloodstream. So for the next slide, and the blood carries all of the drugs to the organs, similar to, as we were saying, with alcohol, and it includes those on which the drug acts. Now, once the drug finds its way to the brain, it will latch onto specific receptor sites in the neurons that are sensitive to particular types of drug. So you'll see different drugs affect different parts of the brain differently. And then the next slide. So finally, the final 2 stages are degradation and elimination. The drug's down by the body, mainly through the liver, to facilitate its excretion. And this is also called metabolism. So when you're testing for degradation products, you're looking more for metabolites. So you can be testing for parent drug or metabolites for drugs. And then the drug's metabolites are excreted. So quickly, if we look at the effects on the human body on the next slide. Okay, so the main part of, so drugs mostly affect your peripheral nervous system, part of the autonomic, can't say it, nervous system. And this is responsible for your involuntary and reflexive functions in the body. So your heartbeat, breathing, blood flow, and digestion. Drugs will affect your sympathetic nervous system. So this is responsible for your fight or flight responses. You'll be really active, ready for action, or the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is responsible for bodily functions while we're at rest, digestion, metabolic processes, and so on. And so why am I telling you this? We're going to look at categories of drugs next, and you'll see that stimulants affect the sympathetic nervous system and sedatives the parasympathetic nervous system. So there's 4 main categories of drugs. If we could look at the next slide, please. So stimulants, we have those associated with feelings of extreme well-being, mental and motor activity, etc. Sedatives, which are also called depressants or downers. They suppress brain activity and slow down the heart rate, slow down the nervous system, etc. We've also got hallucinogens, which are psychotropic drugs that can cause changes in thinking or perception. And then we have cannabis, and we treat cannabis separately because it can evoke all 3 effects. So it's often called marijuana, weed or grass, you'll hear of, and it's a psychoactive drug derived from the cannabis plant. Okay, so if we could move on to the next slide, we'll look at some of these in more detail. So again, looking at stimulants, looking at the different categories, why I tell you this? It's because when you start to test for drugs, you're looking at different drugs available, and a classification helps you to try to determine what you're testing for and what a person has tested positive or negative for. So looking at stimulants, you can see that if you're, say, for example, using a Dräger test, cocaine would show up on a test as COC, amphetamines would show up on a test as AMP, and then ecstasy and crystal meth or methamphetamines, so you'd be testing for methamphetamines, so it's the parent drugs here. Sedatives are fairly similar. Heroin would test as an opiate. Things like morphine, codeine would also, things that are used in prescription medications for pain would show up as opiates. Methadone we can test for, it show up as MTD. And also there's a group that consists called benzodiazepines that you'd be testing for. And this would include anything like Valium, diazepam, temazepam, and Xanax. So although prescription drugs, they're often used as an illicit intoxicants. The only hallucinogen I'll mention is ketamine, which we can test for as KET, and cannabis. The main active component of cannabis is called delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. So you're testing for THC when you test for cannabis. Okay. So I'll briefly go through the different methods of drug testing that are available. If we could look at the next slide, please. And as with alcohol, I would say choose the testing method that is most appropriate for you. So I'll go through each of these quite quickly. If we could look at the next slide, we'll look at blood. So blood is the gold standard for testing for drugs. If we could look at the next slide, please. Yeah. Drugs appear in the blood immediately after injection or inhalation, and a blood sample is taken from the inside of the arm or the back of a palm with a needle. It's forensically sound determination of the being of a person's drug level, and so is widely used and widely accepted. It can be analysis can be reproduced a couple of times and in the future as well, and it's almost impossible to manipulate drugs. The cons for drugs is all about the sample collection. It's quite invasive. You need medically trained staff. You'll probably need specialist facilities, and then you'll need special storage conditions because the samples can degrade in transportation, and there's usually a waiting for test results. So if we look at the next slide, most commonly used or increasingly commonly used, I would say, is oral fluid. And from a toxicological point of view, the crucial point about saliva is it's derived from the blood. So the oral fluid is a complex mixture of components that come from the oral cavity, and it can be tested. As I say, increasingly used for drug testing because the fluid correlates better with blood vessels than urine does. And so you can have a more likely, better assessment of impairment. It's really really easy. It's non-invasive, easy, hygienic to collect a sample. You don't need training. It can be done on site, really close to an incident, and will give very, very quick results. It will also detect your active substance. It's not looking for metabolites. The cons are minimal with oral fluid testing. Risk of contamination if someone's eaten or drunk recently, but this is easily overcome by waiting 15 minutes to conduct a test. And so looking at urine in the next slide, again, it's a widely used substrate for testing drugs of abuse. The advantages are it can be generally provided by a test subject easily and in large quantities. The drug testing methodology is well established, and there's a lot of guidelines and laboratory certification programs that are widely accepted as well. The main challenges are it can be difficult to compare urine results to blood test results, particularly in relation to concentrations, and also a positive result, particularly for THC, doesn't necessarily point to recent consumption. So the results can require some interpretation. Also, the collection and analysis a little bit more invasive, a little bit more tricky, requiring specialist facilities, and adulteration can be common practice as well. And then finally, hair. If we look at the next slide, and I won't go into this too much, when hair samples are tested, as with alcohol, it's very, very similar in that hair can show patterns of misuse or use rather than recent consumption. So they're more likely to be used to looking at patterns of consumption, as I say, rather than to test for current impairment. So to summarize on the next slide, testing for drugs can be performed on a variety of different substrates, including your oral fluid, blood, urine, hair, and nails. Each substrate has strengths and weaknesses about the level of information that can be gained about drug use. So select the substrate that you want to test that will support your purposes for testing. Some materials, oral fluid, blood, provide information on recent consumption and therefore possible impairment. Others, like urine, can talk about general consumption of drugs without direct reference to the current behaviour of the person at the present. And hair can then give you an insight into longer-term history and patterns of use. So I hope that you found this to be useful. If you need any further information, have a look at the RoSPA guide that accompanies the webinar. And for full information on any new products that you may need, take a look at the Dräger website. Beyond that, please get in touch and we'd be more than happy to offer help and advice. So that's me from this morning. I'll hand over to Mark to answer your questions. And sorry, Mark, I haven't left very much time for this part.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. I know in the Northeast we talk quickly, but maybe not quite that quickly. But
thank you. So there are a few questions in the chat which I'll read out because we've got a few minutes left. So Alison's asked, would a forklift driver in a warehouse now be considered a safety critical role?
I mean, that's obviously kind of for your own risk assessment, but I would say certainly yes. I mean, certainly Dräger, we have warehouses all around the world, and the forklift truck drivers in those countries where we have drug and alcohol testing are considered safety critical. There may be people walking around in the warehouse. Obviously, we try to discourage it, but people do go in there. Even in a warehouse where there is nobody other than the forklift driver, it's quite a large device. It's probably capable of doing some damage to him. It also could be capable of doing damage to your product in the warehouse. You know, one of our incubators, if it was to be damaged by a forklift truck driver, you know, would be quite a considerable cost. And also they'll be bespokely made, so it would be a minute delay for the customer. So I personally, yes, we would say it's a safety critical role. Or we certainly categorise it as such.
Thank you. We've had another question from Kevin. So he's asked, can an interlock be fooled by, I'm assuming like another staff member blowing into it to get the vehicle to start?
Okay. I suppose the straight answer in some respects is yes. The interlock isn't capable of doing a DNA test to know it's the person you're supposed to be testing. But there are things we can do. Our interlock can be fitted with its own camera that's mounted in the vehicle. It will take a picture of the person sat in the driver's seat, and they have to be sat in the driver's seat, and that's attached to the alcohol result that you get, so that can be investigated. And increasingly what we find is many vehicles now, for insurance purposes and cost purposes, have cameras fitted already to the vehicle, and it's possible for our interface to our interlock to interface with that camera system, so we can put a timestamp on the camera with the result of the interlock and the time, so you can view that in some instances in real time if that's what your camera system allows. So the answer is, at the end of the day, yes, but there are mitigations that you can do to stop that happening. And also, well, as when Gillian's talked about in the policy, if you are introducing interlocks, you should make sure that that is a specific offence within the policy to supply a breath test to somebody else's vehicle.
Right, thank you. And then one more question we've had. So we're looking for tests to test for THC, but we understand that saliva tests can detect cannabis use for up to 24 hours. So looking at that, how do you kind of avoid the lifestyle challenges? So what people choose to do in their own time?
Okay, I mean, what we're saying with THC, I mean, in urine you can detect it for several weeks. We're looking for the parent drug. We're looking for the actual THC. We're not looking for the metabolite, the acid that it's broken down to. So we would say a standardized joint, if such a thing exists, typically with a cut-off level we use, which is 10, which is the same as the police use, 10 to 15. That we can detect typically between 8 to 10 hours after somebody has smoked one joint. If they've smoked more than one joint, then obviously the levels are going to be higher. So if we are detecting THC in the oral fluid with a 98% confidence, that means that still the parent drug is in the body. So, if it's there, like alcohol, if you drink enough alcohol, you can still measure it 24 hours in breath. Afterwards, you have to have quite a lot. Same with the THC. If you're getting it in oral fluid, it's because the parent drug is still in the blood at a detectable level, as I say, with a 98% confidence.
Thank you. And then I think one final question, because I'm conscious that we are running over slightly. So any advice for a business that employs drivers that move other customer vehicles? So this business has got no fixed base of operation and the drivers are based from home and drive up and down the country.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, we've actually just introduced a new product called Alcatest Go. And that it's come out from legislation that's in Japan covering exactly those situations. And this is a system which uses an Alcatest with a mobile phone that allows you to video yourself doing the alcohol test and then upload that to the cloud where it can be viewed by a manager or something like that. They get a notification to say the test has been done, that the test has passed, or in the worst case, the test has failed. So it's quite interesting that that's just come up, because that's literally something within the last 6 months that we've just developed for the Japanese market, and we intend to bring into the UK market. Well, probably not this month, but certainly in the new year.
Thank you very much. So we have got a couple more questions, but what I'd probably suggest is if I send them over to you by email and you can respond to those, just because in the interests of time. And we have also been asked about sharing the recording. We will be sharing that after the webinar. You'll get an email following up. So thank you to both of our wonderful speakers today. We really appreciate your time. And before you go, we'd just like to encourage anyone here today who's interested in occupational road safety to join our SCORSA project, which is a free membership platform to help businesses manage occupational road risk. And you can sign up for free for that at scorsa.org.uk. So I'm going to draw today's webinar to a close. So thank you all for attending today, and thank you again to Gillian and Mark, who've provided some really useful information. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.